different. That it had to do with something completely something different. We're in part 2 of this study, and unfortunately I don't know why it blipped like this. I gotta find out why it blipped like this, but this is the second part. This term is used in the Old Testament to designate God's mysterious power. It is not used to designate the agent of human conception. And let me say this again. It's referring to not so much of a divine intervention, because it now brings a big problem. If, for example, we assume that what this theologian Brown says is true, that this was a normal, a complete divine intervention, and therefore Jesus' Father is now the Holy Spirit, and it was not an impregnation of the soul of the Messiah in a human being, but rather it was really God intervening. God now takes over as in the man's role and impregnates Mary with his sperm. Let me use the correct word. His divine sperm, and he now becomes meshed into man God, which is the concept which the Catholic and the Christians go after, the evangelical. Then we have a problem. He is automatically disqualified, as we will see in a few seconds, as being able to say that he's of Davidic descendant, because the promise was clearly that it would come out of the sperm of David, of the seed of David. And a sperm cannot be something spiritualized. Can I say, well, God is God the Father, so God can create the sperm of David and say, no, my friends, the promise is very, very specific. If he's not of the loins of David, that he comes from the male line of the house of David, he cannot have any rights to claim that he's the Messiah son of David, nor sit on the throne of David. And thus, as such, he completely disqualifies as being the Messiah and disqualifies as being a descendant of David. And thus, he's out of the picture. And what you're really saying is God is an adulteress. Chas b'shalom. What you're saying in essence is that God has committed adultery with a married woman that was supposed to be that of Joseph. How can God go against his own word? And even more so, we learn as Jews that God keeps the very same commandments that he tells us to keep. God is a faithful God. God does not commit adultery, my friends. So we have another problem. The other problem that we have here, as we will see, is this whole story that continues on all the way to verse 25. And here we find a whole entire big problem. Let's go start wrapping up a little bit of what we're talking about here. The problem of this, that the angel told him in a dream not to worry, the child was conceived by the Holy Spirit, and Joseph should go ahead and marry her anyhow, as it almost replicates the cover-up of what took place with King David and Bathsheba. Those of you who remember the whole story will probably remember. It appears to be something drawn from that allusion. Almost as if the child that was in Bathsheba's stomach wasn't really, it was really Uzziah's child. And we find out that really this is where the story breaks, because it wasn't Uzziah's child, it was David's child. And anybody that says that David committed adultery don't have their facts really correct. Because we learn in that passage that, in fact, David, many years before, in order to avoid the problems of a wife being in a state of aguna, of a state where they didn't know if the husband was still alive or not, as long as there was a doubt, they had to assume that the man was still alive until evidence showed otherwise. David created a contract of divorce that when the men of war would go out to battle, they would give a conditional divorce to their wives, so that in the event they would not come back from the battle, their bodies were missing in action, it would be retroactively reactivated if they came back. But if they didn't, they would be automatically divorced and free to be able to remarry. Yes, remarry. This David had created. and was approved by the Sanhedrin. It was an act of mercy and kindness shown to the wife who was left behind in the event that the husband would not come back alive. So when David sees Bathsheba, she was already in clearance. She was, technically speaking, a single woman, because Uzziah was out on war. When he came back, here we see the intention that David wanted to cover it up. Not that he committed adultery. He wanted to cover it up. And he told Uzziah to go back into his house. And what did Uzziah do? Disobeyed the order of the king. Which, by the way, those of you who study a little bit the Talmud Sanhedrin knows that that's a capital offense. He disobeyed the order of the king, which meant immediate death penalty. Because of those of you who want to criticize David and say, well, David put him at the front of the line and he wanted to purposely kill him, he had every right to kill him at the very moment he disobeyed. His sin was not what you guys supposed to think that it was. But it was on a level much higher than that. What he did was something that was completely dishonest. He was trying to cover up. And here, what we have in the gospel is a cover-up. What you're telling us, Mr. Brown, is that God is trying to cover up his sin of committing adultery with Jesus so that Joseph will be forced to take Mary, his wife, as his wife. So that everybody thinks, oh, he's of the descendant of David. That, my friend, is the greatest laughing stock that we have seen in the world. So therefore, for us, this is the reason why we say, this is not the case. You're calling God an adulteress. Your gospel is calling God an adulteress. He's an adulterer, I'm sorry. And Mary is an adulteress because she was already committed in contract form before Joseph took her as his wife in this act. She should have been stoned. Was espoused to Joseph. The Greek word espoused literally means in the Greek here to give a souvenir or an engagement present. This is different from the word for used in espouse in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 2, which is mean to be betrothed. According to the Talmud in Sanhedrin 21a, a woman must be married with a ketubah, which is a document that provides for a marriage settlement in three ways which a Jewish man to be legally married with a formal document: transfer of money or sexual relations. In other words, bi'ur or bia, which means to have intimacy. The text states that Mary and Joseph's was legal's wife. That's what the text is saying. The text says that Mary and Joseph was legally married, not his espoused would-to-be wife. For in verses 16 through 19, it clearly says that Joseph was Mary's husband, and they are referred to husband and wife throughout the rest of the gospel. If they were true God-fearing, observant Jews, they would not be allowed to be alone together, certainly not to live together, if they had merely been engaged. And since there is no mention of there being anything between verses 18 through 19, it is clear that they were already married at the beginning of the gospel. In other words, let's put one up for the Nazarenes. Because in this case, the evangelical, the Catholic, and the Messianics have it wrong. Verse 20, and the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream. This also occurs in Matthew chapter 2, verse 13 through verse 19, verse 22. God speaking to the people in dreams and foretelling future events signifies that the person is a prophet. It is odd that very little is made of this, as Jesus as being the son of a known prophet would certainly be a great PR for in relations to Jesus than the adopted son of an incompetent carpenter. We'll look at the commentary later on Matthew chapter 8, verse 2. We have to ask, who made Joseph prophet? Did he appear before the Sanhedrin as is required? Why was Joseph never mentioned as a prophet? In a few places in the gospel where Joseph is never mentioned as a prophet, is never called a prophet, It is with this belief that Jesus could be the Messiah, when he was simply the son of an ordinary man, according to Luke chapter 4, verse 22. It should also be pointed out that nowhere in Luke is Joseph mentioned as having any sort of prophetic visions. Mary, Jesus' mother, who is not mentioned in Matthew as having any prophetic vision herself, and Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, were, however, given the status of prophet. Joseph, fear not to take Mary thy wife, reaffirming what we just said earlier. Thy wife, not the betrothed. The word used for take in verse 20, do not be afraid to take Miriam home as your wife. In the Greek, it comes from two Greek words, para, besides, as in the word parallel, and lambano, to take. In other words, the New Testament uses the word such as Luke 9:28, Jesus took Peter, John and James with him. Or in Matthew, take one or two other things, or two other along, NIV version. It has this meaning, to take someone alongside. Nowhere else in the New Testament does it take on the connotation of to marry that is in Matthew 1:20. In order to make sure that the theological interpretation of the word, as here indicated, betrothed to marry, is clear, words have been deliberately added to the English text, words that are not originally found in the Greek. The following example shows how this can be done. The underlined words, for example, that I'm going to mention to you in English are not found in the Greek text. For example, in King James we find, fear not to take, unto thee is not found in there, but it's underlined, marry thy wife. Literally says, fear not to take, marry thy wife, not unto thee. New American Standard Version reads, do not be afraid to take Miriam, underline, as your wife. It literally says, do not be afraid to take Miriam, your wife. I want you to notice the subtle translation interpolation that occurs here in those translations. Do not be afraid to take Miriam home as your wife is how the NIV has it. Underline home as in your NIV version, because that was not in the original Greek manuscript. It literally says, do not be afraid to take Miriam, your wife. Miriam, your wife. Let me say that again. Mary, your wife. Miriam, your wife. Mary is your wife. Joseph, Mary is your wife. Not that she will become your wife. She's your wife. She's pregnant. The additional excess not found in the Greek text occurs again in verse 24 with the words that we just mentioned above, where the text reads as, take with you Miriam your wife. Behold, a virgin shall be with child. Now we go to the fun part. As with other quotes in the New Testament, the first quotation of the Tanakh, which Christians call the Old Testament, which for us it's the only Testament, has been taken from the Septuagint version of Isaiah 7:14 and is taken out of context. The New Testament has the word Betulah, or virgin. The Hebrew word in Isaiah 7:14 has the word Alma, which means young woman, not virgin. The Hebrew word for virgin is Betulah. That would be the equivalent of Parthenos in Greek. The sign mentioned in Isaiah was given to Ahaz 700 years before the events in the New Testament transpired. Since the verb hara is used with ha'alma is in the present tense, along with the use of the definite article the young woman, ha'alma, this indicates that the person was someone Isaiah and Ahaz both knew. As for the name Emmanuel, this is the only place in the entire New Testament where the name is mentioned. Jesus was never called Emmanuel. Please, can someone show me where Jesus is called Emmanuel? Since the Christian claims of Jesus' authority is based upon his supposed divine nature, This divine nature is based on the virgin birth. This is a crucial distinction. Verse 24, then Joseph, raised from the sleep, did as the angel of the Lord had bidden him. The Talmud in Ketubot tells us the tradition. It began in the time of David, how married men, and I mentioned this earlier, were married off going to war on a dangerous journey, secretly gave their wives paper for divorce. Since the law clearly says the woman whose husband had no witness to his death cannot remarry, she could hold on to these papers until she was sure that her husband was dead, then produce them and obtain the divorce. This, more than likely, was what Joseph wanted to do, and why the account in Matthew calls him just. He wanted to make sure that just in the event of his death, Mary could remarry and be provided for, which would indicate that Joseph and Mary was in an area of danger. Why was Joseph traveling? Both of the text and tradition are obscure, but Luke chapter 2, verse 1 through 3 tells us of a census. But there is no historical record of ever this taking place. Why would Joseph leave a very pregnant wife to fend for herself to go on a very dangerous journey? Next to the census story, of which there is no other proof of it happening, the most probable explanation concerning the 3 festivals each year for which every Jewish male were required to travel to Jerusalem. Joseph, being the just man, would have kept this law. At that time, hundreds of Jewish men were crucified along the roads of Galilee by the vengeful Romans, and for it during the time of the rebellion led by Judas of Galilee was going on during the same period of time. Take a look at Josephus, Wars of the Jews, chapter 2, verse 8 and 1, and 17, verse 8. Josephus probably feared that the Romans would find him at a wrong place at the wrong time and nail him at a tree or onto a tree. The narrative of Matthew 18, verse 20 can thus be explained this way. Before Josephus and his wife Miriam went on a journey, she became pregnant. And because of her pregnancy, and due to the whole volatile situation in the Galilee, Josephus decided to go alone. And in case he did not return, he privately gave her papers for divorce, as was the custom when a husband was forced to make a dangerous journey to go off to war. This was to assure that in the case of a lack of any witnesses to death, Miriam could remarry. Before Josephus or Joseph left, however, an angel spoke to him in a dream and told him that it was safe to take his wife with him on the journey. This account is from a different Judaic perspective, certainly makes more sense than the current Christian theological explanation. And it should be noted that the Matthew does not say that Joseph traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. That tradition is from Luke chapter 2, verse 4. Verse 25, her firstborn son. The word here, firstborn in the Greek, was added to the Greek text centuries later because of theological teachings of the virgin birth. The earliest and most important texts, such as Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, omits the Greek word for firstborn. For those of you who have a black marker, as I mentioned to you earlier, whenever it says Christ on there, you have to remove it, and here in firstborn, you need to remove it until she had been born. And this is in agreement that she had born a son. There's nothing here that indicates firstborn. It's absent in the Vaticanus, in the manuscript B, and also the Syriac, and the different Syriac versions, and the Old Latin version, her firstborn son. Also absent in the Sinaitic Syriac, in the different ancient manuscripts. She bore to him, Joseph, a son. My friends, what we find in this entire birth story of Jesus is some really creative work done by some of the more recent Christian scribes in order to create the illusions of a virgin birth. What we find here is the story of the birth of a Jewish male, of a descendant of David, and thus the implications of being impregnated by the Holy Spirit does not mean that it was a byproduct of God and woman. Rather, that the soul of the Messiah was alluded to in this birth story by the word pregnant by Ruach HaKodesh. And it's interesting, this was a very traditional way of bringing about a holy conception according to the Rechabite tradition. There's a lot of materials on that. Look for Rechabite impregnation online, and you'll have a whole bunch of information. It's so public now that it is incredible. But my friends, what we're looking at is not your traditional view of a birth of a son of God, but a birth of a Jew who basically, under incredible duress by threats of the Romans, were protected by a divorce system which was produced by King David himself to ensure the freedom of a wife who suffered as a result of not knowing if her husband was alive or dead. Make sure you get this message out to your friends, your Christian pastors. I would love to hear their response. I would love to hear their interaction. Again, we're not here to knock anybody down, but to study. After all, isn't that what Paul, the Christian Paul, says? And told to Timothy, study to show yourself approved, a workman who has nothing to be ashamed of. And this is our intent. And to explain why we Orthodox Jews, and any Jew who studies, will come to the realization that in fact Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was born into a family that one may say was of Davidic descent. He was of Malachut, as Tractate Sanhedrin mentions. But my friends, he did not make it. He did not pass the first level of even a potential Messiah. He tried to gather everybody together, and he failed. And we're going to look later at that one important verse that says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will bring it back up. But the Christian scribes had to add an interpretive version to it. This he spoke about his body and resurrection. It's not what it says in the manuscripts. Things were added and changed. How can you rely on something that has been so pigeonholed, so changed and reconstructed and reformed on a constant basis? And even if you go to the study to find out what it really meant, it contradicts the very dogmas of Christianity, of Catholicism, and even of these messianic groups. My friends, my fellow Jewish friend involved in these movements, the best thing I can say, wake up and smell the coffee. It's time to come home. It's time to get out of Edom. It's time to come back to your people. I'm waiting for you. Give me a call. You know my number. Shalom, shalom.